The sun cast its golden light upon the endless blue waters as Odysseus stood on the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The salty air filled his lungs, and the cries of seagulls echoed through the air, their snowy feathers glistening in the morning light. He wore a simple hamacia, its folds blowing gently in the breeze, and his weathered skin glowed with a warm flush. The wooden hull of the ship creaked beneath his feet, a familiar sound that brought him comfort. "The journey home begins," he whispered to himself, his voice carried away by the wind. The crew, busy with their tasks, cast occasional glances at their leader, their faces tense with excitement and trepidation. As the men raised the sails, the ship lurched forward, and Odysseus felt his heart quicken. The men's practiced movements lifted the sails, and the ship glided across the waves, leaving the shores of Troy behind. As the day wore on, the sun beating down upon the deck, Odysseus's men stumbled upon a treasure trove of golden armor left behind by the legendary Achilles. The armor sparkled in the sunlight, adorned with precious gems that caught the men's eyes. "A symbol of good fortune, perhaps," one of them whispered, his eyes shining with excitement. Odysseus examined the armor, his eyes narrowing. He knew the gods could quickly turn their favors to wrath. Still, the discovery brought hope to his men. They celebrated, their laughter and shouts filling the air, and for a moment the dangers of the sea receded. As they raised their cups in a toast, the sound of clinking metal and the smell of wine filled the air, and Odysseus felt his chest swell with pride. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the waves, Odysseus gathered his men around him, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The sea can be calm and gentle one moment, and furious and unforgiving the next," he warned, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We must be vigilant, always prepared for the unexpected." The men nodded, their faces set with determination, and Odysseus saw fear lurking behind their eyes. They knew they were sailing into the wrath of Poseidon, who had vowed to thwart Odysseus's journey home. As darkness fell, the men retired to their quarters, their voices hushed and their movements quiet. Odysseus remained on deck, his eyes fixed on the stars beginning to twinkle in the night sky, his mind racing with the challenges ahead. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull and the creaking of the wooden beams broke the silence, and Odysseus's breath caught in his throat like a cold wind on a winter's night. The sound of clashing steel and the cries of terrified animals filled the air as Odysseus's men slaughtered the sacred cattle of Helios. Odysseus's voice rose above the chaos, his words laced with a mix of anger and desperation. "Stop this madness. You will bring the wrath of the gods upon us." But his men, driven by their hunger and disregard for the divine, ignored his warnings. The smell of blood and smoke hung heavy over the scene, a potent reminder of the transgression that was taking place. Eurylochus, one of Odysseus's most trusted men, stood at the forefront of the carnage, his sword stained with the blood of the sacred beasts. "We must eat, Odysseus," he shouted back, his voice firm but laced with a hint of uncertainty. "We cannot survive on empty bellies." Odysseus's face twisted in a mixture of horror and frustration as he realized that his men had crossed a line from which there was no return. The gods would not forgive this sacrilege, and Odysseus knew that the consequences would be dire. The sky grew dark, as if the very heavens themselves were responding to the atrocity that had been committed. The wind began to pick up, whipping the waves into a frenzy as a storm started to brew on the horizon. Odysseus's men, still reeling from the aftermath of their actions, scrambled to prepare the ship for the impending tempest. "Raise the sails!" Odysseus bellowed above the growing din of the storm. "We must ride this out!" But his words were lost in the howling wind as the storm hit with a ferocity that seemed almost divine. The ship creaked and groaned under the pressure, the wooden beams straining against the force of the waves. Odysseus clung to the rail, his knuckles white with tension, as the ship was tossed about like a toy. The thunder boomed and the lightning flashed, casting eerie flickers of light across the chaotic scene. The men's cries and shouts were drowned out by the cacophony of the storm, leaving Odysseus to wonder if they would survive the wrath that had been unleashed upon them. The storm raged on, its fury unabated, as the ship was battered by wave after wave. Odysseus's men clung to whatever handhold they could find, their faces set in grim determination. But despite their efforts, the ship was taking on water, the hull breached by the relentless pounding of the sea. "We must abandon ship," Odysseus yelled, his voice barely audible above the din. "We cannot save her." The men hesitated, unsure of what to do, but Odysseus knew that there was no other choice. The ship was doomed, and if they did not act quickly, they would all go down with her. With a heavy heart, Odysseus gave the order to abandon ship, and his men reluctantly followed him into the unknown. The darkness of the stormy night swallowed them whole, leaving them to fend for themselves in the cold, unforgiving sea. The last thing Odysseus saw was the ship, her mast broken and her hull breached, being pulled under by the waves. Then there was only the darkness and the sound of the storm. The chaos of the storm and the darkness of the night made it impossible for Odysseus to keep track of his men. He called out, his voice hoarse from shouting, but there was no response. The waves crashed against him, threatening to pull him under, and he clung to a piece of wreckage, his fingers numb with cold. "Eurylochus, Antiphus, where are you?" he shouted, but the only answer was the howling wind. Odysseus's heart sank, his fear for his men's safety overwhelming him. He had lost them, and he was alone, adrift in the vast expanse of the sea. The storm raged on, its fury unabated, and Odysseus was left to face the darkness, his spirit unbroken, but his body battered and bruised. He called out again, his voice carrying away on the wind, but there was only silence. The sea was a vast, empty space, and Odysseus was just a small, insignificant figure, lost and alone. The morning air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers as Odysseus stood on the deck, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Land ahead," he called out, his voice carrying across the water. The men rushed to the rail, their faces set with a mix of excitement and trepidation. As they drew closer, the sound of music drifted across the waves, a melody that drew them in. "The sirens," one of the men whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Odysseus's grip on the rail tightened, his mind racing with the stories he had heard of the sirens' deadly song. "Plug your ears," he ordered, his voice firm and commanding. The men hesitated, their faces pale, before nodding and stuffing their ears with wax. Odysseus, however, did not plug his ears, instead choosing to have himself bound to the mast, his wrists and ankles secured with rope. "I want to hear their song," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon, "but I will not be swayed." The ship sailed closer, the music growing louder, more alluring. Odysseus felt his heart pounding in his chest, his senses reeling from the beauty of the sound. The sirens' voices were like nothing he had ever heard before, a harmony of pure joy. He strained against the ropes, his body arching forward. "Odysseus, do not listen," one of the men cried, his voice muffled by the wax in his ears. But Odysseus was beyond reason, his mind consumed by the music. He pulled against the ropes, his willpower weakening with each passing moment. The ship sailed on, the music growing fainter, until finally they were out of range, the siren's song fading into the distance. Odysseus let out a breath, his body relaxing, his mind clearing. He had resisted the siren's song, but at what cost? The sun beat down on the ship, the men's faces flushed with heat, as they sailed into the calmer waters of a secluded cove. Odysseus stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the shore, searching for any sign of danger. Pine needles and olive leaves filled the air with their scent, and birds sang from the trees. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was a peaceful scene, one that belied the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. As they dropped anchor, a giant emerged from the trees, his one eye fixed on the ship. "Cyclops!" one of the men whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Odysseus's hand on the hilt of his sword tightened, his mind racing with strategies. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, was a monster, a creature of legend, and Odysseus knew that they had to be careful if they were to survive. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low and even. "We do not know what we are up against." The Cyclops loomed over them, his massive frame casting a shadow over the ship. Odysseus stood tall, his eyes locked on the giant as he introduced himself and his men. Polyphemus's gaze was unyielding, his one eye piercing as he regarded the strangers. "I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca," Odysseus said, his voice firm and commanding. "We come in peace, seeking shelter and hospitality." The Cyclops' expression did not change, his face a mask of stone. "You are not from around here," he said, his voice like thunder. "What brings you to my island?" Odysseus hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Polyphemus's demeanor put him on guard, and he decided to play it cautious. "We are travelers," he said, his voice neutral. "We seek only to rest and replenish our supplies." The Cyclops' gaze narrowed, his eye glinting with suspicion. "I will give you food and shelter," he said. "But be warned, I am not a man to be trifled with." Odysseus nodded, his mind racing with the implications. They followed Polyphemus into his cave, the smell of smoke and animal hides filling their nostrils, the sound of dripping water echoing off the walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the sound bounced off the stone. Odysseus's eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of danger. Odysseus's calloused feet pounded the dusty earth as he walked towards the palace, his tattered himasa clinging to his weathered skin. Sunlight warmed the landscape, illuminating the worn stone walls and the bustling market square. People milled about, going about their daily business, oblivious to the king's return. Odysseus's eyes, a piercing brown, scanned the crowd, locking onto the suitors who had taken over his palace. His jaw clenched, a determined glint in his eye as he made his way through the throng. "Xenia demands." "I be given shelter," he said, his voice low and gravelly as he approached the palace gates. The guards, two burly men with thick beards, eyed him warily, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. "What business do you have here, beggar?" one of them growled, his tone dripping with disdain. Odysseus's eyes locked onto the guards, a spark of defiance igniting within them. "I come, seeking the kindness of the queen," he replied, his voice measured, his words laced with authority. The guards exchanged a skeptical glance before stepping aside, allowing Odysseus to enter the palace. As he walked through the corridors, the sound of laughter and music drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread. Odysseus's stomach growled, his senses heightened as he navigated the familiar yet alien surroundings. He ran his hand over the wooden chest's carvings, the touch stirring memories. The guards' demeanor changed, their tone shifting from hostility to curiosity as they asked, "What is your name, traveler?" Odysseus's eyes narrowed, his jaw setting in a firm line as he replied, "I am a man in need of shelter, nothing more." The guard raised an eyebrow, his expression incredulous as he said, "You expect us to believe you're just a beggar, and not the king returned to reclaim his throne?" Odysseus's gaze locked onto the guards, a fierce glint in his eye as he said, "I expect to be treated with the respect due to a guest, nothing more." The guard's face fell, his expression uncertain as he stepped aside, allowing Odysseus to pass. The setting sun spilled into the room, casting a golden glow over the scene as Odysseus pushed open the door to the armory. Telemachus, his son, stood tall, his eyes shining with curiosity and wariness as he faced his father. Odysseus's eyes, red-rimmed from fatigue and emotion, locked onto Telemachus's, and he opened his arms, embracing Telemachus in a tight hug. Telemachus's arms wrapped around his father's waist, holding him close, as the two shared a moment of tender reunion. Odysseus's hand stroked Telemachus's hair, a gentle gesture as he whispered, "I've come home, my son." I've come to reclaim our kingdom." Telemachus's eyes looked up at his father, shining with tears as he said, "We'll do it together, father." Clanging metal and hushed conversations filled the armory. Odysseus and Telemachus stood surrounded by the steel glint of swords and the leather creak of armor. Odysseus's eyes, a piercing brown, scanned the room, locking onto the suitors who were gathered in the great hall, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. His jaw clenched, a determined glint in his eye as he handed Telemachus a sword, the leather hilt creaking as his son took it, his eyes locked onto the blade. Telemachus's face set in a determined expression as he looked up at his father. The decision to arm his son hung in the air as the weight of their actions settled upon them. The sound of clashing steel would soon fill the air as the fate of their kingdom hung in the balance. The suitors continued their revelry, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. Odysseus's eyes locked onto the door, his mind set on the battle to come as he steeled himself for the fight ahead. The armor, once a symbol of protection, now felt fragile against the chaos that would soon erupt. Odysseus's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, his fingers wrapping around it like a vice as the two prepared to face their enemies. Sweat and metal hung in the air as Odysseus faced off against Antinous, the leader of the suitors. The great hall was a battleground, the sound of clashing steel filling the air. Odysseus's eyes, a piercing brown, locked onto Antinous' and he charged forward, his sword flashing in the dim light. "You've taken everything from me," Odysseus said, his voice low and deadly. Antinous sneered, his eyes flashing with contempt as he raised his own sword, the two clashing in a flurry of steel and sparks. Odysseus's movements were a blur, his sword slicing through the suitors as he fought his way towards Antinous. The two clashed, their swords meeting in a shower of sparks as Odysseus struck the final blow, his sword slicing through the suitors' defenses. The suitors fell, one by one, as Odysseus stood victorious, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his eyes shining with triumph. The room was silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of the survivors, as Odysseus stood tall, his sword still trembling with the force of the final blow. Odysseus's gaze swept the room, his eyes locking onto the survivors, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The bodies of the suitors lay strewn across the floor, a stark reminder of the battle's outcome. Penelope's fingers trembled as she wove the final threads of the burial shroud, the fabric a result of her patience and dedication. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing louder with each passing moment. She rose from her chair, her himashia rustling softly, and made her way to the entrance of the chamber. As she pushed aside the curtains, warm light spilled in, illuminating the figure standing before her. Odysseus, his weathered skin, a map of his journeys, his eyes sunken from the weight of his experiences, smiled wearily as he beheld his wife. Penelope's face cracked as she rushed into his arms, tears streaming down her cheeks. They clung to each other, the world around them melting away as their joyful sobs filled the air. "I will never leave you again," Odysseus whispered, his voice trembling with conviction. "I swear it, my love." Penelope's grip tightened, her voice barely audible. "You must promise me you will rebuild our kingdom and bring peace to our people." Odysseus nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I will, my love, I will." The palace courtyard resonated with the sound of laughter and cheers. The people of Ithaca, freed from the suitors' tyranny, gathered around their king, their faces filled with curiosity and admiration. Odysseus, his toga draped over his shoulder, raised his hands, and the noise subsided. His voice carried across the courtyard as he spoke of his journey, of the trials he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. The crowd listened, entranced, as Odysseus told his tale of perseverance and cunning. As he finished, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the palace. Odysseus sat upon his throne, his eyes locked onto Penelope, who stood by his side, a smile on her face as he let out a deep breath. The courtyard began to empty, the people of Ithaca returning to their homes, their hearts filled with renewed hope and faith in their king. The stars twinkled above as Odysseus stood on the balcony, the night air filled with the scent of olive trees. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room as Penelope sat beside him, her hand intertwined with his. Odysseus's gaze reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Memories swirled in his mind as he thought of the men he had lost, the struggles he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. The silence between them was comfortable as they sat together, hands clasped. As the night wore on, Odysseus's thoughts turned to the future, to the rebuilding of his kingdom and the rekindling of the love that had sustained him. He smiled, his eyes never leaving the stars, as Penelope leaned her head on his shoulder. The weight of his responsibilities settled upon him, but with Penelope by his side he felt a sense of peace, a sense of home that he had not known in years.